Good evening. This is Peter Krushka, and this is my presentation of Postgres, a relational database. This is for Professor Green's ISA 4220 class. Postgres, just to give you some background, is an open source relational database. Apparently it's very popular. Now, a database is essentially a collection of interrelated tables, and these tables maintain records in the form of data in the form of records, and use primary and foreign keys to associate those records. A well-designed database must be normalized. There are typically 6 forms of normalization, and some of those normalization forms, like a normalization, first normal form, the database must be set to be atomic. And as we were checking Wikipedia, they say that Postgres is ACID compliant, where the first letter A in ACID stands for atomic, which means that every field in the database must have a unique data value. For example, a street address and a city name could not exist in the same field. Those would have to be 2 unique fields. And if a database is properly normalized, then these records can maintain what's called referential integrity, which means that if a record, for example, if customer information is updated in one field, all the records associated with that customer will get the appropriate update. All right, let me go straight to Postgres hardening. And these are 10 steps that I copied directly from the link that's at the top of the page. So I'm not going to take any credit for this, but I will discuss some of these later on in this presentation. So one of these things is trust security. There's going to be a file we're going to talk about, Postgres _hba.config file, and you'll see where this trust security comes into play. I'm not going to discuss hash-based column encryption. Bullet point 3, use physical separation to isolate data. Equifax could have taken some lessons from this. They should have segregated their data sets into multiple physical different locations, and that could have prevented some of the entire loss of data that they suffered. Postgres SQL typically uses port 5432. It's the common port for this particular database, and one of the recommendations is to lock down that port level access. Once again, here's the file I mentioned before, the Postgres _hba.conf, and that'll specify who can use the database. And in this particular bullet point, they're talking about SSL encryption, and I will discuss that a little bit more depth in just a moment. The next bullet point, prevent connections from networks that don't require database connections. Again, that same configuration file. Set appropriate monitoring logs for database queries. That's outside the scope of this discussion. Consider disabling remote access to Postgres SQL. All right, we can do that. And again, I will touch on that in a few more slides. And assign a distinct role for each application. I'm not going to discuss that. And then in general, stay on top of critical updates and patches, which is an overall recommendation. But especially if this particular database is used for any financial or credit card transactions, then that's an absolute requirement. One of the things I discovered was to prevent server spoofing. And what the recommendation is to use Unix socket directories for local connections. Now, if you recall from some of your earlier classwork, in Unix or Linux, you have your file formats of, in that first field, I've got S, RWX, RWX, RWX. RWX is read, write, execute for the users and groups. And the S in this case represents a socket. It could be a dash, which represents a typical file, or an L for a link, or a D for a directory. Now, a socket is basically, in my understanding, is a marriage of a port number and an IP address. So in local connections, we can establish this socket directory and when the database is dealing with inter-process communications. It's more of an assurance of who they're communicating with, who the database is talking with. The next major bullet point is to use secure socket layer certificates to prevent spoofing via TCP. This is going to be something of a complex configuration, and I'll touch on a little bit, but I'm not going to go too deep into this. But basically, the server is configured to accept only host SSL connections. And I don't demonstrate this, but I'll show you where it could be placed in a file. And the server.crt and server.key files must pre-exist. Hardening with SSL, this is just a little bit more in-depth of what we just discussed. SSL support must be compiled into the application. So the application's got to be built from the ground up with SSL support. There are a number of files here. One is the PostgreSQL.conf file. Inside that file, the SSL must be set to on. Then the Postgres_HBA.conf file. And again, I will show you where the SSL is configured in that. A third file is defined SSL in the OpenSSL.cnf file. Then there's yet a fourth file, SSL_ciphers. So this hardening with SSL is going to be a complex set of interrelated files. You've got PostgreSQL, the Postgres_HBA file, the OpenSSL.cnf, and the SSL_ciphers. I'm sorry, that was in the PostgreSQL.conf. All right, here I'm actually going to start discussing this Postgres_HBA.conf. This file works in what's called records, and these 7 bullet points represent the format of a record. So there's a columnar format. You've got local, database, user, then an authentication method, and some options or addresses. So these are the 7 particular formats, and I'll discuss them in just a little bit more depth. Now, earlier on, we saw for example, you saw local and host. Well, these are the field names. So that first field in these records can be local, host. These are bullet points 1, 2, 3, 4 represent some of those operations. Local, which would be a local host. Excuse me. Local for local machine, host, the name of a particular host. A host SSL, now we're talking about using SSL, which I alluded to this before. Or host no SSL. Database would refer to the name of a database. The user, it could be a named user or it could be all. Address, IP address, IP mask. Address could also be the name of a machine. For example, example.com. All right. And these are some of the authentication methods. First one on the top of the list is trust. Now, if you recall a few slides back, the first bullet point was do not use trust security. Well, here's where that starts coming in. This is one of the authentication methods. It's possible that if it's a local environment, you're dealing from, let's say, machine A to machine B, then a trust might be appropriate. But if not, then you can use the reject command. But again, it would be situational dependent as to which authentication method was used. Then you've got an MD5 hash function. I'm going to skip over these next two, so I'm not familiar with them. Then you've got Cerberus 5 identification, which means that the database would have to authenticate the user trying to log into the system. Here I'll skip over something similar to identification. You've got LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. Perhaps one server, one database needs to communicate with the Postgres database. Radius is remote access dial-in. depends on the environment whether that is required or not. And then certifications and PAM I'm not going to discuss. I'm not familiar with that. Now here's an example of the actual post or pg_hba.conf file. Now let's see if you can see it here. So you've got these comments here, and this is the very top. This is a generic file. It says type local. So any local environment, all databases locally, all users, trust them. So this is interconnections between machines within the same environment. Now you've got a host. This one is all databases, all users, local host, and again, we're trusting. Now in this next line over here, this third record, got host. We want to talk with a Postgres database, all users, and all users coming from address 192.168.12.10. And they're saying to particularly use the MD5 hash method. So if MD5 is not used, then this would be rejected. Next one is host all. Again, it's a very specific address. And they're saying to reject this. And in this particular case, it's a generic address, and they can use the Cerberus method. And that is the conclusion of this presentation. What I have found so far is that Postgres is a very sophisticated database, and it requires some in-depth configuration to set it up and harden it properly. So with that being said, I bid you all a good day, and I hope you learned something from this presentation. Thank you very much.